In 2020, he was the UFC's breakout star. Despite overcoming some adversity this year, Khamzat Chimaev appears to be on a fast track to greatness in 2022. But how much do you really know about his fascinating backstory? Let's find out. First, he is truly born to be a fighter. Many combat sports athletes find their way to their chosen martial art as they reach a certain level of maturity, with many standout MMA stars having joined a gym as early as their preteen years. Khamzat, on the other hand, began his wrestling training at the age of 5 when he joined a junior wrestling program in Chechnya, which would eventually lead him to a life of fighting. For 22 years, he worked hard to hone his skills, putting himself in uncomfortable situations both in competition and in training. When you stop and think about it, it really does explain why he's such a handful when the cage door is locked. When most children reach the age of 5, they are busy playing with toys and perfecting the art of running in a straight line. Chimaev was already learning the skills that would propel him to superstardom at this point. Simply put, this guy is built differently than the rest of us. It's no surprise that he's such a relentlessly exceptional fighter once the fight gets to the mat. He has built his entire life for fighting, and as we all know, his results have more than justified his dedication. Next, a prime background. Anyone who has watched Chimaev fight for even a minute will undoubtedly conclude that he has a strong wrestling background. Khamzat won national wrestling titles in 2016, 17, and 18 across 2 different divisions, cementing his reputation as one of the best wrestlers in the country. After a lifetime spent on the mats, it's only natural that he's now regarded as one of the most offensively devastating wrestlers in MMA. Chimaev was 23-0 as a freestyle wrestler in Sweden prior to his transition, and a recent victory over UFC middleweight and fellow Swede Jack Hermansson brought his record to 24-0. That victory, like most of us, was incredibly dominant as he won the bout by a score of 8-0. Hermansson, who was no small middleweight, was rendered helpless by Chimaev's extremely effective traditional technique and was unable to mount much of his own offense. Now, his real name. Though we all know Khamzat by his chosen surname Chimaev, most of you probably don't know that his real name is Khamzat Girikhanov, which he competed under for much of his childhood. Given his reputation as a child wrestler and later as a national champion in Sweden, many of his wrestling contemporaries would have known him by this name. However, as time passed, Khamzat chose the name Chimaev, which means Chechen Viking, as well as the name Boris, which means wolf. And yes, we must admit, it does have a certain ring to it, don't you think? Khamzat resembles an ancient warrior, and with a name like Chimaev, he's clearly stacked the deck in his favor. Next, an unexpected source of inspiration. Despite Khamzat going on to make very public threats against his fellow UFC fighter Conor McGregor, which we'll discuss in more detail later, the majority of you will be unaware of Conor's indirect influence on Chimaev's MMA career. As surprising as it may sound, Khamzat himself stated that he was inspired to start training in MMA after witnessing McGregor knock out Jose Aldo in 2015. However, before you think Boris is a fan, keep in mind that it was more of an "if that guy can do it, why can't I" thought pattern than anything else. Chimaev is clearly not a fan of the Irishman, but it still came as a surprise to his fans that his exposure to the man he would later make very public threats to set in motion his path towards mixed martial arts. Would it be possible that if Jose Aldo had won, he would not have made the moves that led him to the UFC? Perhaps, perhaps not. Overall, the link between Khamzat's fighting career and the divisive superstar that is Conor McGregor is a peculiar one, to say the least. Now, his multi-divisional career. You're probably aware that Khamzat's UFC career has seen him compete at both 170 and 185 pounds. However, you may be surprised to learn that his pre-MMA days were also filled with multi-divisional triumphs. Boers not only competed at close to his natural weight in freestyle wrestling, but he also won national championships at weights as high as 202 pounds or 92 kilograms. Some athletes take a more conservative path to the top in order to manage risk and avoid any unexpected setbacks in their pursuit of success. If you haven't already guessed, Khamzat Chimaev is not one of those guys. A complete freak of nature who could soon find himself in the exclusive group of dual-weight UFC world champions. However, with the figure of Kamaru Usman holding the welterweight title, Chimaev will undoubtedly have his hands full before he can seriously consider a return to the middleweight division. Now, his early challenge. It's tempting to think that Khamzat's early career saw him take a relatively easy path to the UFC. But all things considered, during his time fighting in Brave CF, he faced some pretty tough competition. During that time, he happened to meet another hugely promising prospect, Ikram Aliskerov, a Sambo world champion who looks set to be another huge addition to the next wave of Dagestani talent to make moves in the top flight. Chimaev was put to the test in that fight, even though it was brief. Bors was forced to improvise after Aliskerov stopped several of Khamzat's attempts. Thankfully, Chimaev's incredible knockout power came into play quickly, and a perfectly timed uppercut knocked his opponent out cold. In the time since, Ikram has gone 3-0, demonstrating that he is still a fighter to keep an eye on, and for Khamzat, this remains one of his more underrated victories. Next, held in high esteem, Khamzat has been training at Sweden's All-Star Training Center since making the switch to mixed martial arts, a gym where he regularly spars with the likes of David Teymur, Ilir Latifi, and most notably, three-time UFC light heavyweight title challenger Alexander Gustafsson. Gus has obviously fought alongside some of the greatest fighters of all time. To name a few, John Jones, Daniel Cormier, Fabrizio Verdum, and Glover Teixeira. Back in 2019, before Khamzat was even close to making his UFC debut, the press questioned the Mauler about his talented gym mate, and he called Chimaev one of the best fighters he had ever worked with. And when you consider the wealth of experience that Alexander brings to the table, don't you think it's a pretty hefty compliment? Although he can be abrasive to those who oppose him, Chimaev is an excellent training partner and a humble and hard-working presence in the gym. It makes sense when you consider his success and growth over the years, doesn't it? Next, a vacation cut short. One memorable story from recent MMA folklore is Khamzat's attempt to enter the country of Ireland in 2018 to track down and beat up Conor McGregor for comments he made leading up to his massive fight with Khabib Nurmagomedov. McGregor, who managed to enrage millions during that bout's fiery pre-fight press conference, apparently did enough to elicit rage from Chimaev, who was an amateur MMA fighter at the time. When Khamzat arrived in Dublin, he was first escorted through security before being taken to a cell. He claims he was left there for 8 to 9 hours before being told to fly back to Sweden. Whether or not it's entirely true, it's a pretty hilarious piece of storytelling from the welterweight contender. Could you imagine what would have happened if he had run into Conor and a group of his associates in Dublin? Perhaps it's best not to speculate on how that might have turned out. Now, a debut on short notice. We've all heard the story of Khamzat's 3 UFC debut fights, how he set records for the quickest turnaround in UFC history, as well as the fastest 3-fight win streak in the promotion's history. But what many people forget about Khamzat's first UFC appearance against John Phillips is that he stepped in with only 7 days' notice to make his UFC debut. Being Dusko Todorovich's replacement and answering the call when it came, Chimaev was primarily fighting at 170 pounds in MMA prior to this, only dipping into the 185-pound pool twice in Brave CF. So, when it came time to fight, he flew to Abu Dhabi with little time to prepare before facing the powerful Welshman in a higher weight class under the world's largest promotion. Sure, everything that came upon his victories over Rhys McGee, Gerald Meerschaert, and most recently Li Jingliang was incredible in its own right. However, the story behind the risk that came with Khamzat Chimaev's last-minute debut was equally intriguing in our opinion. Lastly, the king of fight bonuses. And finally, we have an intriguing statistic for you that you were unlikely to find anywhere else. Despite only fighting 4 times under the UFC banner, Khamzat Chimaev has earned 4 Performance of the Night bonuses. It makes sense, given that he has easily dispatched all of his opponents. What's crazy though is that Khamzat has already earned more post-fight bonuses than some of the game's most recognizable faces, namely champions such as Petr Yan, Aljamain Sterling, and even Alexander Volkanovski. When you think about it, with his relatively short UFC career in mind, it paints a pretty vivid picture of how impressive he has been thus far. And that's a wrap for this video. See you in the next one.